rAskReddit. Adopted people, when did you find out that you're adopted? I was adopted very soon after my birth. I found out when I was 6. My parents sat me down and talked to me about how they tried and could not get pregnant, and they got me. They stated if I ever wanted to know anything, feel free to ask, and they would be 100% open and honest, and would even help me contact my birth family. I honestly was like, okay, now back to what we were talking about before. It never changed anything for me. I have never reached out. My parents who raised me are my parents. It doesn't matter who gave birth to me. We have been through good and bad. They have picked me up and supported me. They have taught me life lessons and been who I go to for problems and advice. They have been the best thing that has ever happened to me. 99.9% of the time I forget I'm adopted. The only time it ever comes up is for family history and med exams. I did look up my birth family on FB and other social media platforms, and I do have a ton of half brothers and sisters. I'm talking 6+ range, and this sounds very judgmental, and I'm sorry, but based off what I've seen, my birth mother did the right thing. I would not have the life I have today, or the opportunities, if she would have kept me. I will always thank her for that. Maybe one day we will meet, but as it sits now I have no desire. Not me, but my best friend is adopted. He was telling me that when he was like 9 or 10, his parents were trying to subtly bring it up to him by giving him a bunch of kids' books about adoption. He interpreted this as his parents saying they were going to put him up for adoption. One night at dinner they were like, "Friend, we had something to talk to you about." So he bursts into tears thinking they were about to say they were putting him up for adoption. But instead, they told him he was, in fact, adopted. He told me he was like immediately relieved and didn't even care because he was so scared of being torn away from his family. All was well, and he apparently adjusted to the news really quickly. Funny story with a wholesome end. My parents started telling me when I was far too young to have any idea what the word meant. They included it in bedtime stories when I was an infant and then a toddler. I never didn't know, so it was just part of the bedrock of reality. As a result, it never bothered me in the slightest. I have an adopted older brother, and my mother tells both of us that she has enough information to put us in touch with our biological parents if we ever want it. Neither of us has ever asked for it. I feel no need to meet the biologicals. I had perfectly acceptable parents, and they are my parents, which is what I tell people who say, "Do you ever wonder what your real parents are like?" I have no idea what possesses some parents to put off telling their kids. Any postponement is bad. Just tell them right now. I was adopted at just a few days old, and I don't really remember a time that I didn't know. My parents told me at a very young age and bought books and things like that to help me understand. So it's always been a part of who I am. My parents are my parents, and going on 40 years now I've not once had any interest in learning who my birth parents are. I actually have 2 sisters that my parents were able to have naturally. A procedure came along after my adoption that allowed them to have children, and when we got in fights as little kids I threw out the "oh yeah, mom and dad actually chose me" or something like that. I was adopted at near birth, and my parents told me at a very young age. It feels like I've always known, and it feels normal. It actually felt strange to me when I was a child that people lived with those that gave birth to them due to my normal being the contrary. Thought I'd mention this. I adopted my son when he was 10 years old. I was his big brother then in the Big Brother program. When the adoption was finalized, he burst into tears and said this was the best day of his life and that he loved me. I'm in my 80s now, and several years ago I looked for a retirement home to move into. My son stopped me and insisted that I move in with him and his family, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. Not adopted, but my wife adopted my son. He was informed and involved throughout the process and super excited when the big day came. From my perspective, the bond between the two of them went from very strong to Flex Seal Epoxy to a TIG weld. It's a beautiful thing to see every day. I always knew. My longtime foster parents adopted me when I was 9 years old. I lived with them off and on from 10 months until 5 years old. Then permanently since 5 yo. Took until I was 9 yo for parental rights to be taken away. My now wife already had a son when I met her. He has always seen me as his dad, although he knows I'm not his biological father. We decided we would ask him if he wanted to be legally adopted when he were old enough. I had completely forgotten about it until I saw this post. My wife and I just discussed it, and we are about to ask him. I'm really excited. I was 9 when I found out. My adoptive parents were going through a divorce and my mother was terrified my dad would tell me out of spite. So, we went out to breakfast, and she broke the news. At the end she told me I knew who my biological mother was, and I don't know what instinct it was, but I knew immediately. I guess I always knew I had a connection to this woman. So, then my mom was telling me it's okay to feel confused or have questions. She asked me what I was thinking and feeling, and I said I'm not sad or upset. I'm lucky enough to have 2 mommies who loved me enough to make this choice. One that loved me enough to know she couldn't raise me, and another to take me in instant tears from my mom. That day I felt a little more loved, not for any reason other than I learned that someone loved me so much she knew she couldn't give me a lifer, and another person loved me so much to take me the day I was born, and love me as if there was no question I was her daughter. Met my dad at 17, and well, that's a whole different story for a whole different thread. My parents told both my sister and I when we were both very young, so it really was never a big deal. With that being said, it took until my mid-20s or so to realize just how lucky I was, and to this day I'm super thankful my biological mother, she was 20 and unmarried, made the decision to give me up for adoption. It was kind of funny. My parents adopted me at birth, and when I were 3 or 4 years old I said I have another set of parents. And they were like, well, that's true. Then I kept playing with my toys. I've met my biological parents when I was 12, 13. But I'm not interested in having a relationship with them. I mean it was just curiosity. Sometimes I forget that I'm adopted lol. When thinking about some health things that are hereditary, like hair or that kind of stuff, I'm like never mind, I'm adopted. I found out when I was 23 because I had recently moved into a house of my own and my birth mother found out, went to the house, and tried to tell me who she was. I told her she was crazy and to get off of my property. I called my dad about it and told him what happened, and he asked if I had told my mom about it, and I said no. About 30 minutes later he asked me to come over and showed me the folder with all the documentation. I told them that I was okay with all of it and it actually helped make sense of a lot of the stuff my parents had done over the years and questions I had asked in the past. One weird thing is that my buddy had gone over to my house while I was at my parents and I walked in and told him to guess what I just found out. He saw the folder in my hand and said, "They finally told you were adopted." I had no idea that his entire family had known all of this time and never told me. I found out that my ex also knew about it because she had looked up my medical records when she worked as a nurse at a hospital and saw it. I realized later on that she probably found out about the house because I had apparently added my half-brother on Facebook a while back, even though I didn't know who he was at the time, and he had been keeping tabs on me for years. I was adopted a couple months after I was born. I was born premature, so I was really tiny and super sick. My mom was a drug addict and didn't even know my dad, ironically, so she couldn't even keep me and didn't even want me. So lucky for me, I was put up for adoption where my adoptive mom and dad adopted me. I also have other adopted brothers. My parents fostered a bunch of other kids before adopting the 4 she has now. Me and my 3 brothers, all adopted, none of us blood related. I don't remember much, but I was on the verge of dying of asthma and all the other issues with my heart. But I'm super healthy now and no longer have asthma. I didn't really care that I was adopted, but I get upset sometimes knowing my adopted mom didn't even want me. But I'm lucky I didn't have to stay with a horrible mom. It's something I've always known. I can't remember a time I didn't know. At the time, it was a pretty bold decision by my parents to tell me because I was adopted in the early 1960s and most people tended to keep it a secret. I guess this was due to the stigma surrounding illegitimate birth or the idea that the biological mother must have been loose. Instead, my mother always told me that the woman who gave birth to me cared enough about me to realize that she couldn't look after a baby and ensured that I was brought up in a home where a child was truly wanted. That gave me the confidence to stare down anyone who tried to tease or shame me. My parents always said they would support any decision I made about searching for my biological parents, but I never felt any need. Technically not adopted, but my dad is sterile, so I'm the result of a sperm donor. I figured it out in middle school when I asked my dad, the man who raised me, about our blood types. I'm A+ and both my parents are O+. My dad got upset, so I dropped it. Then 2 years ago I took a DNA test and found a biological uncle from my donor's side. Then my parents came clean about everything. They cried telling me. I laughed and told them I've known since 7th grade. My dad doesn't remember the blood type conversation. I've met my biological uncle. He told me things about my dad and showed me a couple pictures of him when we were about the same age. I look exactly like him. I also found a half sister in the same situation. We are going to meet up this summer. I really don't care if I ever meet my biological dad. The one that raised me. I pretty cool.